The first sign was a swelling the size of an egg. It appeared overnight without warning in the soft place where the neck meets the jaw, or beneath the armpit, or in the crease of the groin. It was hard and hot to the touch, and it hurt in a way that pain usually doesn't, not sharp, not dull, but a deep, pressurized throb that seemed to come from somewhere below the body's ordinary register of discomfort. By morning, the person who had it knew that something was wrong. By the following morning, they usually had a fever. By the third morning, many of them were dying. This is the story of the people who weren't. Welcome to Dull Tales. I'm glad you found your way here tonight, wherever you are and whatever brought you to a history channel at this particular hour. If you're new, this is what we do here. We take the past and we slow it all the way down. We follow ordinary people through extraordinary circumstances, and we try to find what was real and human in the middle of it all. No shouting, no dramatic music, no countdown clocks. Just the story, told slowly, the way it deserves to be told. Tonight we're going somewhere that most history books treat as a catastrophe, which it was, but rarely treat as a human experience, which it also was. We're going to Europe in the middle of the 14th century, to a continent in the grip of the worst pandemic in recorded human history. We're going to find the people who woke up one morning and found the world changed, and who still, somehow, had to decide what to do with the day. Get comfortable. The lights can go low. This one will take a while, and that is entirely the point. And if you want to tell me where you're listening from tonight, whether it's somewhere that once knew the plague firsthand or somewhere far from all of that, leave a comment. I read every one. Now let's go back. It began, as far as anyone in Europe could tell, somewhere in the East. There were stories first. There are always stories first. Fragments of rumor carried by merchants along the trade routes, arriving weeks or months after the fact, describing a sickness moving through the cities of Central Asia, through the oasis towns of the Silk Road, through the ports of the Black Sea. The stories were vague and inconsistent in the way that second-hand accounts of catastrophe always are, too large to be credible, too persistent to be dismissed. Something was happening out there, beyond the edge of what the European mind could clearly see. Something was moving west. The year was 1347 when it arrived. 12 Genoese trading vessels docked at the port of Messina, on the northeastern coast of Sicily, in the autumn of that year. The ships had come from Caffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula, and the journey had taken weeks. The port officials who went out to receive them found most of the sailors already dead at their oars, and those who remained alive were sick in a way that nobody on that dock had ever seen before. They had the swellings, hard, dark buboes the size of eggs or apples, visible at the neck and armpit and groin, some of them already weeping black fluid. They were bleeding from their skin. Their breath was foul in a way that went beyond ordinary illness. The smell coming off the ships carried across the water before anyone had even tied off the mooring lines. The Sicilian authorities ordered the ships immediately back out to sea. They stood on the dock and watched the vessels push away from shore, and they told themselves that it was over, that the thing on those ships would die with the sailors on the open water, that the harbor of Messina was safe. They may even have believed it, in the way that people believe the reassuring thing when the alternative is too large to hold. It was too late. The rats had already left the ships. This is the detail that changes everything, the detail that nobody on that dock understood and wouldn't understand for another 550 years. The disease was carried not by the sailors, but by the fleas on the black rats that had been living in the ship's holds for the entire voyage from Caffa, and the rats were already ashore, already moving through the streets and the granaries and the stone walls of Messina, carrying the bacterium in their blood, leaving fleas behind them wherever they went, and the fleas were hungry. Within days, people in Messina were dying. Within weeks, the disease was moving north and west, following the trade routes the way diseases always follow trade routes, which is to say, everywhere and quickly. Let me take you to a woman named Teodora. She lives in Messina itself, in a house near the harbor that her family has occupied for 3 generations. She is 46 years old, broad-shouldered and dark-haired, and she works as a fish seller, one of the women who buy from the boats in the morning and sell through the afternoon at the market near the port, a trade that requires a rivvy. NG before sunrise and a voice that carries across a crowded square, and the kind of relationship with the smell of fish that only develops after years of complete immersion in it. She watched the Genoese ships arrive. She was at the harbor that morning for her usual buying, and she stood at the edge of the dock with the other market women and the fishermen and the dockworkers, and watched the port officials board the vessels, and then watched the expressions on those officials' faces when they came back down the gangplank. And something in those expressions told Teodora, before any announcement was made, before any official word was given, that the world had just changed in a way she was going to need to pay close attention to. She went home and told her husband to close the shutters. Her husband, a carpenter named Benedetto, who has spent 20 years building the furniture that her practicality has told him to build, asked her why. She said, because something came off those ships, and I don't want it in our house. He closed the shutters. Their immediate household survives the first wave of the Messina outbreak. This is not because Teodora understands the mechanism of transmission. Nobody does, in 1347, and the shutters don't stop rats or fleas in any meaningful way, but because her instinct to withdraw, to reduce contact, to keep her family behind closed doors while the harbor quarter collapses around them, happens to be more protective than anything the physicians of the age are recommending. She does not know why she is doing the right thing. She only knows that the faces on those officials told her something, and she has spent 46 years learning to trust the information that faces carry. Outside her shuttered house, Messina is dying. The deaths in the first weeks are rapid and comprehensive. The disease moves through the harbor quarter, the densest, most crowded part of the city, with a speed that the chroniclers struggle to describe without sounding hysterical, which they are, because what is happening is genuinely without precedent in living memory, or in any story that living memory has access to. People who are healthy at breakfast are dead by nightfall. Families are extinguished in days. The priests run out of capacity for last rites before they run out of dying people who need them. And so the dying die without the sacramental preparation that every Christian of the age has been told is essential for the soul's safe passage. And this, the spiritual terror of dying unshriven, is in some ways as devastating as the physical dying itself. Teodora hears this through the walls. She hears it in the crying from the house across the narrow street, which goes on for 2 days and then stops, and the stopping is worse than the crying. She hears it in the diminishing sound of the market square, which is usually one of the loudest places in the city, and which by the end of the 3rd week has gone almost completely quiet. She hears it in the change in the quality of the harbor sounds. The loading and unloading that generates a constant industrial percussion has slowed, then stopped, because the dockworkers are dying and the ships that might have brought more commerce have instead begun avoiding Messina entirely, word having spread along the coastal shipping routes that this is not a port to visit right now. She hears occasionally the sound of the carts. The carts that move through Messina now serve a single purpose, and everyone in the city knows the sound of them. They move mostly at night, because whoever organized this has decided that the sight of them in daylight is more than the living population can endure, and so the sound of them comes through the shuttered windows in the small hours, the wooden wheels on the stone streets, the occasional voice of a driver, and Teodora lies in the dark beside Benedetto and listens and counts, because counting is the thing her mind does when it cannot stop itself from processing what it is hearing. She stops counting at some point. There is no number that helps. Weeks pass. The worst of the immediate outbreak in Messina subsides, not because the disease is finished, but because there are fewer people left to infect, which is how a disease that kills this efficiently eventually slows in a given location. The harbor is quiet. The market has some vendors again. There are more empty houses in the quarter than full ones. Teodora opens the shutters. She stands in the doorway and looks at the street, which she has not stood in for 6 weeks. The street is familiar in the way that a familiar thing is familiar after a long absence, everything in its right place and everything slightly wrong. The butcher's stall across the way is closed. It may never reopen. The shrine to the Virgin at the corner has new flowers, which means someone is still placing them, which means someone is still here and still doing this, and she finds this more comforting than S. He can explain. She goes to the market. There is bread. She buys some. It is the same bread she has bought for 30 years from this market, dense and white, and she holds it for a moment before she puts it in her basket, holding it the way you hold a thing that has become newly significant by its continued existence. The bread is still here. She is still here. Benedetto is still here. The children, 2 of them, grown, living in other parts of the city. She does not yet know about the children, and this uncertainty is the stone she carries as she walks home through the quieter than it has ever been streets of Messina on a November morning in 1347. She will learn by the end of the week that one of them lived and one did not. She carries this too. She carries it the way that parents carry the particular grief of outliving a child, which is a grief so specific and so complete that it constitutes its own country, one that you move to involuntarily and never fully leave. She carries it without putting it down, because there is no putting it down, because the grief is now part of the structure of who she is. And she keeps going to the market. She keeps buying bread. She keeps opening the shutters in the morning because the morning comes regardless, and the shutters are there to be opened, and the bread is there to be bought, and she is still here. Now let me take you north and east. Let me take you inland, away from the ports, to the places that the disease reaches not by ship, but by the slower movement of people along the roads that connect one village to the next, one market town to the next, one region to the next, the disease traveling at the pace of a walking person, which is slower than a ship but which covers, given enough time and enough roads, everything. Let me take you to a woman named Agnes. Agnes is 31 years old, a baker's wife in a village in the north of England, and it is the autumn of 1348 when our story finds her. The plague has been moving through England for months, arriving on the southern coast in the summer and pushing steadily north and west, and the news of it has reached Agnes's village in the form of stories that seem too large to be entirely true. People in the south are dying in numbers that don't fit any category she has for mass death. The death counts she has been told about belong to the scale of battles, of famines, not of ordinary sickness. She is not afraid yet. Or rather, she is afraid in the background, the way you are afraid of something that has not yet arrived, which is a different kind of afraid from what comes later. Her life in this October of 1348 has the texture that it has always had. Dense, practical, organized around the rhythms of the bakehouse and the seasons and the children, and the slow accumulation of ordinary days that constitute a life lived close to the ground. Her husband Thomas is the baker, as his father was before him, and the bakehouse behind their stone house runs on a schedule as reliable as the tides. The large stone oven must be fed before dawn. The dough must be mixed the night before and left to prove in the cool of the storeroom. The bread, a dense, dark maslin loaf of wheat mixed with rye, must come out at the right moment, not before the crust has set properly, not after it has dried past the point of softness. Thomas knows this timing in his body, the way a sailor knows wind, through years of repetition that have built knowledge below the level of conscious thought. Agnes's role in the bakehouse is the role of every baker's wife, everything that isn't the baking itself. The accounts, the flour purchasing, which involves a relationship with the miller that requires constant diplomatic maintenance, because the miller is a difficult man who gives better prices to people who manage him well, and Agnes has spent 8 years learning to manage him. The selling, taking the finished loaves to the market stall twice a week, counting coin, giving correct change, managing the customers who want to argue about the weight of a loaf, of whom there are always several. The cleaning, the organization of the storeroom, which must be kept dry and ordered or the flour spoils and then nothing works. She does all of this alongside raising two children, Maud, who is 7 and sharp-eyed, and already beginning to develop the specific practical intelligence that Agnes recognizes as her own, handed down, and William, who is 4, who is round and loud and throws himself at the world with a confidence that Agnes finds both exhausting and deeply reassuring. She feeds the chickens in the gray morning light of early October and thinks about the rye flour that arrived last week and whether it's dry enough to use. The cold is coming in from the north. She can feel it in the ground under her feet, the particular hardness of earth beginning its seasonal contraction. The sky is the color of pewter, and the rooks are loud in the elm trees at the edge of the field. She does not think about the plague. The plague is still 3 weeks away. In those 3 weeks, the world continues to be ordinary. The bread comes out of the oven. Maud goes to the priest for her letters. William falls in the mud twice and has to be dried both times by a fire that Agnes builds specifically for the purpose, watching her son steam gently in the heat and thinking that she would build 100 fires for this, that this specific task, drying a muddy 4-year-old, is one of the better things about being alive. Thomas sells bread at the market on Thursday and comes home with news from a draper who came up from the south. A town 2 days' ride away has had deaths, several deaths, the swellings. The priest has administered last rites to 4 families in a single week. Agnes listens. She doesn't say anything immediately, which is how she processes information, receiving it fully before responding to it, turning it over in the silence of her own mind until she knows what she thinks. Thomas interprets this silence as equanimity. It is not equanimity, it is calculation. That night she tells him, no more customers in the bakehouse. Sell at the market at distance and come home directly. Thomas says, "You're being excessive." Agnes says nothing more. She has learned, in 8 years of marriage to a man who is good-hearted and somewhat stubborn, that the best argument in some situations is simply to implement the position and let the results speak for it. She implements the position. Over the following 2 weeks, while the plague works its way through the villages to the south of them, and the news from the market grows darker with each Thursday's return, Agnes runs the bakehouse on a new logic. Thomas bakes. She sells, at the stall, with a gap between herself and the buyers that she maintains without explanation. She stops buying anything that has passed through too many hands. She keeps Maud home from the priest's lessons, which produces a conflict with the priest that she absorbs without particular difficulty, because the priest's feelings about her pedagogical choices are considerably less important than her daughter's continued existence. She watches the village. She is always watching the village, in the specific way that a woman who has lived in one place her entire life watches it, knowing every face and every house and every variation from the normal pattern that might mean something. The first variation she notices is the tanner Robert's door, which stands open at an hour when it is usually closed. She notices this on a Wednesday morning. On Thursday, Robert does not come to the market. On Friday, she hears from the miller's wife that Robert is sick. Agnes goes home and stands in her kitchen for a long moment, looking at the fire, calculating. The plague has arrived. The first death, Robert, happens on a Sunday, 4 days after the open door. His wife, a thin, quiet woman named Edith who Agnes has always liked without knowing well, carries on with the help of 2 neighbors who are either very brave or do not yet understand what they are walking into, which in the short term amounts to the same thing. Then the priest's assistant, a young man of perhaps 20 whose name Agnes has never learned, because he has only been in the village 6 months, having come from somewhere to the south to help an old priest who has too many parishes and too little energy. Then a child. Agnes does not let herself count yet. Counting too early, she has found, is a way of beginning a story that you cannot stop once you have started it, and she is not ready for that story yet. Instead, she keeps the bakehouse running and keeps her children close, and watches with the flat, careful attention of someone who is gathering information against the moment when information will be needed. That moment comes on a November afternoon when she sees the smith's wife being helped into a neighbor's house, one arm around a neighbor's shoulder, her face the color of candle wax. Agnes watches from across the street. The smith's wife, her name is Ellen. Agnes remembers now Ellen. She used to buy bread on Thursdays and sometimes stay to talk about her garden. She had opinions about cabbages, turns her head as she is being helped inside, and her eyes find Agnes's across the distance of the street. They look at each other for a moment. Then Ellen goes inside. Agnes walks home. She goes into the kitchen. She sits down on the stool by the fire. After a moment she gets up and starts making the evening meal because the evening meal needs to be made, and the children need to eat, and the fire is already going, and there is nothing else to do. Ellen dies 4 days later. Agnes helps lay her out. This is one of the duties that the women of a medieval community perform for each other: the preparation of the body, the washing and dressing of the dead before burial, and it is Agnes's first tea. Me doing it for someone who died this way, of this particular disease, and she approaches it with the same practical care she brings to everything, alongside something else that she doesn't have a name for, something that has to do with the specific weight of Ellen's hands, and the specific quiet of the room, and the specific age of a woman, who was not much older than Agnes herself, and who had opinions about cabbages. She works with an older woman named Joan, who has done this before, and who moves through it with a quiet, practiced competence that Agnes finds both comforting and faintly terrifying. Comforting because Joan's composure holds the room together. Terrifying because of what that composure implies about how many times Joan has done this, and what the world must look like from inside that experience. They wash the body, they dress her in her best cloth, they fold her hands. Agnes walks home in the cold evening air, through a village that is quiet in the way it has been quiet for weeks now, the particular quiet of a place that has pulled inward on itself. Doors closed in the early afternoon, fewer people on the street, the normal sociability of village life contracted to the immediate family and the essential task. She stands outside her own door for a moment before going in. The air is cold and very clear. Above the dark line of the elm trees the stars are out, many more of them than you would see from any modern town, a medieval sky without artificial light, so full of stars that the darkness between them seems incidental rather than primary. She stands there with the cold on her face and breathes the night air, which smells of frost and wood smoke and the faint ghost of bread from the bakehouse, and she looks up at the stars. She stands there for what feels like a long time. Then she goes inside. The children are there. The fire is there. Thomas is there, sitting by the fire with the particular exhausted stillness of a man who has been working since before dawn, and he looks up when she comes in and asks her, with his eyes rather than his voice, how it was. She sits down. Maud brings her a cup of something hot without being asked, which is a small act of perception and kindness from a 7-year-old that makes Agnes's throat close briefly. William is already asleep in the loft. The fire speaks in its low, continuous way. Outside, the stars are doing whatever stars do in the dark. She doesn't speak about Ellen. This is not suppression. It is the specific economy of expression that develops in people when the things that need saying are too large for the words available. She holds the cup of hot liquid and watches the fire and carries Ellen alongside everything else she is carrying, and after a time she feels Thomas's hand find hers in the space between their chairs, and she holds it, and that is enough. That for tonight is enough. Now let me take you somewhere very different. Let me take you south, to the warm and complicated light of Italy, to a city that entered the plague year already wealthy and already frightened, that met the disease earlier than England and with a different set of resources and a different set of vulnerabilities. and that produced, in the course of its suffering, some of the most vivid first-hand accounts of catastrophe that the 14th century left behind. Let me take you to Florence. Florence in the spring of 1348 is one of the most sophisticated cities in Europe. Its population stands at somewhere between 80 and 90,000 people, which makes it vast by the standards of the age. Its wool trade and its banking houses, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Acciaiuoli, finance the wars of kings and the architectural ambitions of popes. Its streets are narrow and magnificent, full of the specific energy of a city that has decided to be better than everywhere else and is in the process of proving it. The great churches are being built. The art is being made. The money is moving through the city in flows of silver and gold and letters of credit that constitute the most sophisticated financial system in the Western world. And in the spring of 1348, the plague arrives. It comes from the south, from the ports of Sicily and Sardinia, and the trading routes that connect Tuscany to the Mediterranean world, and it enters Florence the way it enters every city, quietly, before anyone has fully understood what they are dealing with, in the bodies of people who don't yet know they are carrying it. A young man named Giovanni is 26 years old when the first deaths are reported in his quarter of the city. He comes from a family of cloth merchants, not the great merchant families whose names are on the banking houses, but the solid, middling sort who have built a comfortable life through 3 generations of careful work, a house in the San Giovanni quarter, enough to eat, enough to be frightened of losing. He is not married yet, which in retrospect will seem owe him like something he should not have delayed, though he will not be able to say exactly why he delayed it, because the reason seemed sufficient at the time. He lives with his parents and his younger brother Marco, who is 19 and who is, in the particular way of younger brothers, simultaneously the person Giovanni finds most irritating and most necessary in the world, the person whose presence is such a constant that its absence is genuinely unthinkable, which is not the same as thinking about it. Giovanni is keeping a journal. He is not a literary man in any formal sense. He writes commercial correspondence and account summaries and the occasional letter, all of it competent and unremarkable. But he has begun keeping a journal because the fear has a weight that he needs to put somewhere, and writing is the form that putting somewhere takes for him. He writes in the evenings by the light of a candle, at the small desk in his room that faces east, so that in the mornings he can see the light come up over the rooftops. His early entries in the spring of 1348 have the quality of a man who is watching something he doesn't fully believe in yet. He records the number of deaths in the neighborhood with a kind of detached precision that is clearly a performance of composure rather than composure itself. He records what the physicians are saying, which is that the cause is a corruption in the air produced by planetary conjunctions, an explanation that he finds at once completely inadequate and entirely sufficient, because there is no better one available, and the mind needs something to attach the fear to. He writes, "The smell is different now." He writes, "I do not fully understand what I mean by this, but the city smells different than it did in March." He writes, "I keep the windows closed, but this does not change the smell." Then he writes the sentence that he will not be able to cross out, though he tries. Marco is sick. It begins on a Sunday morning. Marco wakes complaining of a pain in his armpit, a deep ache that he initially attributes to sleeping badly, that by the afternoon is something else entirely, that by Sunday evening has produced a swelling the size of a walnut that is hard and hot under Giovanni's fingers when he touches it, and that Marco pulls away from immediately, because the touch makes the pain surge in a way that makes him gasp. Giovanni knows what this is. He has known for weeks what this is, in the abstract, from the descriptions carried through the city, from the accounts of the physicians, from the evidence of the streets where the carts move with their terrible purpose. He has known it abstractly, as a pattern that applies to other people, as a category that contains other families. And now the category contains his family, and the abstract becomes specific in the way that it always becomes specific eventually, with the particular crushing force of, "This is not a story I am watching. This is a story I am inside." He spends the 4 days of Marco's illness in a state that he will later describe, in a single sentence in the journal, as something between praying and waiting, which he means as a distinction but which in practice are the same activity. A total, helpless attention directed towards something you cannot influence, sustained over days, that constitutes one of the more exhausting things a human being can do. He brings Marco water. He changes the cloth on Marco's forehead. He sits beside the bed in the specific quality of presence that is all he has to offer, which is not nothing. Brother Anselm in Avignon, whom we will meet shortly, understands something important about the value of presence as care, but Giovanni is not there yet. He is just sitting beside his brother because there is nowhere else to be. On the second day, the fever climbs to a height that frightens him in a new way, beyond the abstract fear of the disease into the immediate animal fear of watching a specific beloved body in extreme distress. Marco is not coherent for most of the second day. He speaks to people who are not in the room. He calls for their mother, who is in the room, who says, "Yes, I'm here," and he calls for her again. On the third day, the bubo at his armpit has grown and darkened, and the skin around it has begun to show the discoloration that Giovanni has heard described, but hoped not to see. On the fourth day, Marco dies. Giovanni writes this in the journal in the same careful hand he uses for everything, which is itself a kind of discipline, the discipline of continuing to form the letters correctly when everything else has stopped being correct. He writes, "Marco died this morning." He writes, "He was 19 years old." He writes nothing else for 3 days. When he begins writing again, the first entry is brief. He writes, "Today I will go out." He goes out into the Florence of the summer of 1348, which is a city that has reorganized itself around death with the immersive efficiency of a place that has decided its first obligation is to continue functioning. The usual social rituals of grief, the processions, the elaborate public mourning, the professional mourners who amplify the sorrow of a household into a street performance that the whole neighborhood participates in, these have been abandoned, not because people do not grieve, but because the grief is so general and so constant that there is no longer anyone to perform it for. Everyone is grieving. The performance has no audience because the audience is also on stage. The streets are quieter than Giovanni has ever heard them. Florence is a loud city under normal conditions. The workshops and the markets and the churches and the arguments and the commerce all producing a continuous urban noise that is as much a part of the city's character as its architecture. This quieter Florence is a different city, a city in which the architecture still stands but the sound has been extracted from it, leaving spaces that Giovanni finds more disturbing than any amount of noise. He walks to Santa Croce. The great Franciscan church is open, as the churches have remained open throughout. The city's religious life continues. It must continue. It is the framework within which the dying is happening, and within which the living must find their interpretation of it. But the congregation gathered for the mid-morning mass is perhaps 20 people in a space built for several hundred, and the priest, a young man, younger than Giovanni, the older priest having mostly died, moves through the liturgy with a focused speed that suggests he is rationing himself, conserving something, aware that there are more masses to be said and less time to say them in than there used to be. Giovanni kneels on the cold stone floor. He prays for Marco, which is what he came to do. He prays in the specific way of someone who has not been especially devout, and is now asking something of the divine for the first time in his adult life with genuine urgency, which is a prayer that has a different quality from the routine devotion of a well-managed spiritual life. Rawer, less certain of its form, more genuinely uncertain of its reception. He does not pray for the city, because the city is too large right now for his mind to contain alongside Marco. He prays for Marco, and for his parents who are alive and terrified in the house behind their closed shutters, and for whatever version of Marco exists now in whatever place the dead go, which Giovanni was raised to believe, is a specific and describable somewhere, and which tonight he believes in the way you believe a thing when the alternative to believing it is a void that you cannot look into without flinching. He walks home through streets that carry evidence in every direction. A house with a red cross marked on its door, a sign used in some cities to indicate infection within, adopted informally in Florence, its meaning understood by everyone who passes. An absence at a corner stall that has been there for as long as Giovanni can remember, the cloth seller who set up there every morning since Giovanni was a child, whose stall is not there now and may never be there again. The shrine to the Virgin on the Via dei Servi, where someone has placed fresh flowers this morning. A bunch of late-season roses, still holding their color, their stems in a small clay pot of water, cared for with a specificity of attention that makes Giovanni stop and look at them for a long moment. Someone placed fresh flowers at the shrine this morning. In this city on this day, someone woke up and decided that this was worth doing, that the flowers should be fresh, that the clay pot should have water in it, that the Virgin on this particular corner should know that someone was still paying attention. Giovanni doesn't know who. He will never know who. But the fact of it, the small, stubborn, completely unnecessary act of putting fresh flowers at a shrine on a Florence street corner in the middle of the worst plague in European history, stays with him in a way he won't fully understand until much later. He goes home. He sits at his desk. He looks east, where the afternoon light is doing something complicated with the smoke from the city's chimneys, turning it gold and gray in layers. He opens the journal. He writes, the flowers were still fresh. Now let me take you further south and west, to Avignon, where the Pope has been in residence for several decades in a palace that would embarrass most kings, and where a monastery of Benedictine monks has been living the ordered life of prayer and work and silence that the rule of Saint Benedict prescribes, a life so thoroughly organized by the canonical hours that the day is essentially a series of transitions from one form of prayer to another, with the practical work of the monastery, the farming, the copying of manuscripts, the care of the sick in the monastery's hospital fit into the spaces between. The monastery has 43 brothers when the plague year begins. Brother Anselm is 54 years old. He came to this monastery 30 years ago, the third son of a minor Norman noble who had the traditional third son's dilemma, the church or the military, prayer or fighting, and who chose the church not from particular piety, but from a temperamental inclination toward quiet and order that the military life would have destroyed. He has never regretted this. He is not a man much given to regret, which is itself a product of the monastic life, which discourages the retrospective turning of the self upon itself and encourages instead a forward attention to the task at hand. The task at hand, when the plague arrives in Avignon in the spring of 1348, is survival. This sounds simple. It is not simple. The first death in the monastery is a young brother named Clement, who has been there 4 years and who is 22, and who develops a fever on a Tuesday, and is dead by the following Tuesday, the bubo in his armpit having gone through its terrible progression, with a speed that the older brothers find worse than the slowness they feared. Clement was liked. He had a gift for the illumination of manuscripts, small, precise, vivid marginalia, tiny figures of animals and plants that filled the edges of the liturgical texts he was set to copy with a quiet humor that was technically a violation of the spirit of the rule, but which the older brothers found charming and left in place. He dies on a Tuesday morning, and by Friday 2 more brothers are sick. Brother Anselm watches this and thinks. He is not a physician. He has the basic medical knowledge that any educated person of the age possesses, the humoral theory of illness, the importance of the non-naturals like air and diet and sleep in maintaining health, the general principles of care that the monastery's tradition of hospitality to the sick has accumulated over generations. What he is, fundamentally, is someone who pays close attention. He has been paying close attention for 30 years, in the monastery and in the community around it. And the thing that paying close attention teaches you over time is that patterns exist and that patterns can be read. He reads the pattern of the monastery's deaths and notes. The brothers who are dying fastest are the ones who had the most contact with Clement in his final days. He notes, the brothers who were least in contact with Clement are so far alive. He notes, the disease seems to move between people in proximity. He does not have the vocabulary for what he is observing. He cannot name the mechanism, but he has the observation, and it is enough. He goes to the abbot. He presents his observation without claiming to understand it. He is careful about the distinction between what he has seen and what he can explain, a discipline that has served him well in 30 years of monastic intellectual life, and which now, in this context, carries potentially practical weight. He says, "It seems to me that those closest to the sick become sick." He says, "I do not know why this is so." He says, "Perhaps it is worth considering whether we can reduce the proximity." The abbot listens. He is a cautious man, not naturally given to rapid decisions, and the suggestion Brother Anselm is making touches on complicated questions about the monastery's obligations, to its own community, to the lay population it serves, to the rule which prescribes hospitality and care as fundamental duties. But he is also a practical man, and the evidence that Anselm is presenting to him is in the form of dead brothers, which is a form of evidence that even a cautious man has difficulty dismissing. They implement a modified isolation. The sick brothers are moved to a separate part of the monastery. Contact with them is restricted to the brothers who volunteer to provide care, who accept the risk knowingly, as a kind of vocation within the vocation. Brother Anselm is one of the volunteers. This is not a dramatic decision in the way that dramatic decisions appear in stories. No moment of crisis, no visible turning point, no single instant in which the choice is made and its significance understood. It is simply the logical extension of who he is, of the 30 years that have made him into a person who goes toward the sick rather than away from them. He goes to the hospital wing. And here is where I want to slow down, because what happens in the hospital wing is the kind of history that falls through the cracks of the record, not because it isn't important, but because it is too ordinary to be recorded, because the ordinary acts of care are not the kinds of things that produce documents. Brother Anselm brings water. He brings water to the sick brothers and to the people from the town who come to the hospital, and he brings it in clay cups that he refills from the stone basin in the corner of the room, walking back and forth between the pallets and the basin with a quiet, continuous, unhurried motion that has the character of all the practical care he has given in 30 years, purposeful, undramatic, completely present. He changes dressings. The buboes, when they reach a certain stage of development, open and drain, and this stage, as horrible as it sounds and is actually associated with slightly better outcomes, the body routing the infection through the surface rather than holding it within. He changes the dressings with clean linen, working with the care of a man who understands that what he does with his hands matters even when he cannot say exactly how or why. And he disposes of the used cloth in the way the monastery has learned to dispose of it, in the fire, with a thoroughness that is again instinctively correct for reasons he cannot name. He sits beside people. This is perhaps the most important thing he does, and it is the least visible in any record. He sits beside people who are dying or who might be dying or who do not know whether they are dying, and he is present with them in the specific way that presence is a form of care, not talking constantly, not performing reassurance, but simply being there, a warm and attentive body in the room, acknowledging by his continued existence in their proximity that they are worth being near. He says the prayers, the ones that the dying are supposed to hear, the psalms and the liturgical phrases that the church has built as a framework for the passage out of this life. And he says them not with the speed of the young Florentine priest rationing himself, but with the full weight of 30 years of repetition behind them, the words having a depth in his mouth that they acquire only through long use. People notice this. Isabel notices it. Isabel is perhaps 40, a market trader from the town near the monastery, who arrives at the hospital in October walking under her own power, but barely, her face the color of old wax, a swelling beneath her left arm that she can feel with every breath because breathing requires a motion that moves the arm, and the arm is no longer something that can be moved without consequences. She has come alone because her husband died 3 weeks ago and her daughter is caring for an infant. She lies down on the pallet that Brother Anselm indicates, and she looks up at the stone ceiling of the hospital room, which is the ceiling of a place she has passed many times in her life without ever being inside, and she thinks, this is where people come to die. Brother Anselm sits beside her. He does not tell her she is going to be fine. He does not tell her that God has a plan. He sits beside her with the quiet attention of someone who has learned that presence is its own language, and that the language of comfort has more registers than words. He brings water. He speaks the prayers. He changes the dressing on the bubo, which by the 4th day is beginning to show the signs of opening that he has come to recognize as the body's attempt to negotiate with the disease. On the 5th day the fever is at its worst. She does not know where she is. She speaks to people in the room who are not there, which is something Anselm has seen enough times now to understand as the fever's interference with the mind's ordinary geographic certainty, a dissolution of the boundary between here and somewhere else that the dying sometimes experience, and which is not, he has decided, something to be frightened of on behalf of the person experiencing it. On the 6th day the fever breaks. She lies in the thin light of the hospital window with the cool air on her wet skin, looking up at the ceiling with the specific quality of attention that arrives when the body has been through something extraordinary and is taking stock of what remains. She breathes. She is breathing. The ceiling is the ceiling. Brother Anselm looks up from the linen he is mending. The hospital cannot afford waste, and the mending of cloth is a task his hands know how to do without requiring his full attention, and he sees that she is looking at him. She says, I thought I was going to die. He says, you nearly did. She says, what made the difference? He puts down the linen. He considers this, not performing consideration but actually thinking, in the way that he always actually thinks rather than performing thought, a habit of mind built over 30 years of monastic discipline. He thinks about Clement, who died, about the 3 brothers who died before the isolation was implemented, about the dozen who have survived so far, about whether what he has been doing in this room constitutes help or merely the appearance of help, the form of care in the absence of its substance. He says, I don't know. She looks at him for a moment, then she nods. It is the right answer, not the comforting answer, not the certain answer, but the honest one, and there is something in it that is more useful to her than certainty would be, because certainty in this context would be a performance, and she has been through enough in the past 6 days to have very little patience for performances. She goes home 3 weeks later. Anselm adds her name to the list. The list is a private document, not an official monastery record. It is simply the names of the people he has sat beside, and what happened to them, a column of names and a column of outcomes survived, died, unknown, in his careful, small, consistent hand. He keeps it not for any official purpose, but because the names need to be somewhere, and the monastery's official chronicle records deaths by the names of brothers, which is appropriate for the monastery's purposes, and inadequate for his own sense of what this year requires. The list grows through the autumn. He adds a column. The new column is a single word, written beside every name on the list. The word is person. He starts writing it because he realizes, one evening in November when the list has grown to 43 names, that the weight of what he is keeping is in danger of becoming abstract, that the names are beginning to blur into a list rather than remaining individual, that the 38 who died and the 5 who survived are at risk of becoming statistics rather than the specific, irreducible human beings who lay on those pallets. The word person is his corrective to this tendency, his insistence on the specific against the pressure toward the general that grief produces when there is too much of it. He writes it beside every name. He will keep writing it for the rest of his life. Outside in the monastery, the canonical hours continue: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. The wheel of prayer turns as it has turned for 300 years, as it will turn for 300 more. 21 brothers remain. The choir sounds thin in the cold stone space, but it sounds. The words go up into the vaulted ceiling, and Brother Anselm sends them there with the full weight of everything he has seen, which is considerable, and everything he believes, which is also considerable, and the two things do not cancel each other, the weight of what he has seen and the weight of what he believes, but coexist in him with the particular equilibrium of someone who has been honest with himself for a long time. He writes in the Chronicle, "We are diminished, we continue." 4 words. Let me take you north now, further than England, further than the monasteries of France. Let me take you to the edge of what the medieval European world considers its own, to a country of fjords and gray water and long winters, and a population that lives close enough to the edge of survival in ordinary years, that the arrival of an extraordinary catastrophe has a particular kind of weight. Let me take you to Norway. The plague arrives in Norway in the autumn of 1349, carried by ship. There is a famous ship that the Norwegian chronicles mention, arriving at the port of Bergen in the late summer or early autumn, the sailors mostly dead, the ship drifting into harbor on its own momentum, the people on the dock watching it come and knowing before it has fully arrived what it is carrying. The story of the drifting death ship may be embellished in the telling. It has the quality of a symbol, too perfectly suited to its narrative function to be entirely factual, but the kernel is real. The disease arrives by sea, and Bergen, which is Norway's largest and most connected port, becomes the entry point. There is a fisherman named Havard in a village north of Bergen. He is 41 years old, a broad man weathered by decades of North Sea fishing, who goes out in a wooden boat with 2 other men 3 or 4 times a week when the weather allows, and comes back with cod and herring that his wife Sigrid salts and smokes in the shed behind their house for the long winter ahead. He is not a man who thinks much about the larger world. The affairs of kings and bishops and distant cities are noise at the edge of his attention, stories that other people have, not stories that belong to him. His stories are the weather and the sea and the weight of the catch and the condition of the boat and the long Norwegian night that comes down in autumn like a curtain being pulled. The story of the plague arrives in his village in the way that stories arrive in small communities in pieces, carried by the fishermen who go to Bergen for the salt trade and come back with salt and the news this autumn is not good. People are dying in Bergen, many people, a sickness with swellings. The priests are doing what they can. It is moving north. Havard listens to this and continues fishing. He is not a man who stops doing things in response to information. He is a man who continues doing things while processing information, which is a different and in some ways more functional approach to bad news. He goes out in the boat, he brings back fish, Sigrid salts them, the winter stores grow, the news continues to be bad. In October, the village has its first case. A family at the southern end of the village, a woman who traded cloth with a traveler who had come from Bergen. The woman is dead within 5 days, her husband within 8. The 3 children are taken in by a neighbor who either doesn't understand the risk or understands it and decides that the children matter more. Havard and Sigrid watch this from the middle of the village. They have 3 children of their own, girls of 12 and 9 and a boy of 6, all of them healthy and loud, and completely unaware that anything is wrong beyond the fact that their parents are quieter than usual, and their father has started going to the church in the evenings, which he never did before. He goes to the church in the evenings and sits in the cold dark of the wooden building, which is simple and low and smells of old wood and candle tallow. And he sits there with his thoughts in the way that people who do not have a practice of prayer suddenly discover a need for prayer when the things they rely on show their contingency. He does not know exactly what he is saying to God, or whether God is listening, or whether the framework of Christian belief that he has carried through his life as a cultural inheritance, rather than a personal conviction, is adequate to what he is facing. He sits in the dark and the cold, and does what he can with what he has. Sigrid is more direct about it. She goes to the village's elder woman, a widow of 70 whose name is Ragnhild, and who is the nearest thing the village has to a healer, a keeper of the old knowledge of herbs and preparations that exists alongside and below the official medicine of the church, the pre-Christian substrate of practical knowledge that runs under everything. Sigrid asks Ragnhild what to do. Ragnhild gives her bundles of dried juniper and other aromatic herbs to burn in the house, the smoke filling the rooms with a sharp, resinous smell. She gives her instructions about which plants to avoid and which water sources to use and which to avoid. None of this addresses the actual mechanism of transmission, but some of it happens to reduce exposure to the fleas that are the actual vector. The smoke may discourage them. The avoidance of certain water sources removes one opportunity for contact with infected rats. The knowledge is not scientific. Some of it happens to be correct. Ragnhild herself is dead by November. Havard and Sigrid and their 3 children survive the winter. They are not certain for a long time that this is what is happening. The uncertainty is itself one of the features of surviving a catastrophe that is still ongoing. You do not know, while it is happening, whether you have survived it or whether the thing that will get you is still coming. You can only continue doing the things that have so far not killed you and pay attention and wait and continue. By spring, the deaths in the village have reached 1 in 3. 1 in 3 of the people that Havard has known his entire life. The fisherman who taught him to read the weather. The woman who made the best flatbread in the village and who sold it at the summer market. The old priest who said Mass in a voice so low that you had to sit in the front pew to hear the words. The family at the southern end, all of them gone, the house standing empty, its door banging open on a March morning when the wind comes in from the fjord. Havard stands outside that empty house on a March morning and looks at the open door for a long moment. Then he goes down to the harbor and checks the condition of the boat. There is a repair needed at the bow that has been needing doing since October and that he has not had the attention to deal with. He gets the tools and begins the repair. The boat needs to be ready. The sea will still be there. The fish will still need catching. He works through the morning on the bow repair, his hands knowing what to do, and the sound of his mallet on the wood is the only sound in the harbor, and the fjord is gray and cold and wide, and the sky above it is the particular pale Norwegian blue of early spring, and he is alive, and the boat is being repaired, and this is the fact that the morning has to offer. He accepts it. Let me take you back to Paris now, to a city that is neither a small fishing village nor a magnificent Italian merchant republic, but something in between, and something entirely its own. The largest city in Western Europe north of the Alps, a city of perhaps 200,000 people packed into an area that would constitute a single arrondissement of the modern city. A place of extraordinary intellectual life and extraordinary squalor, coexisting at a density that makes both more intense. Paris in 1348 is home to the university, which has been producing Europe's educated class for 150 years and which has, in response to the plague, done what universities do. It has formed a committee. The committee has produced a report. The report has concluded, after careful deliberation, that the plague is caused by a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius in 1345, which produced a corruption in the southern air that has been moving north ever since. The scholars who produced this report are not stupid. They are, by the standards of their age, exceptionally well-educated men applying the best analytical framework available to them. The framework is wrong. The plague is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, spread primarily by fleas on black rats, a fact that will not be established for another 546 years. But the scholars do not know this, cannot know this, and so they work with what they have, which is astrology and humoral theory and Aristotelian natural philosophy, all of which are internally consistent and none of which leads to the fleas. Their advice when it comes is a mixture of things that are harmless, things that are useless, and things that are by accident, through the back door of reasoning that goes wrong but occasionally stumbles into the right place, somewhat helpful. They recommend burning aromatic woods to purify the air, which does nothing for the disease but may reduce the flea population. They recommend avoiding fruits and vegetables, which is nutritionally terrible advice. They recommend maintaining emotional equilibrium and avoiding grief and fear, which is useless as a medical prescription, but which, if followed, and the evidence of the survival literature suggests that maintaining routine and function does seem to correlate with better outcomes, operates through a mechanism the scholars cannot see. The committee produces its report, and the city continues dying. There is a woman named Marguerite who lives near the Isle de la Cité, in a building that has been in her husband's family for 2 generations, a narrow house of 5 floors where Henry the carpenter occupies the ground floor workshop, and the family lives in the 2 floors above, and 2 other families rent the upper floors in an arrangement that provides income and occasional conflict in roughly equal measure. Marguerite is 38 years old. She is a seamstress, taking in work from the merchants and the minor nobility of the city, altering and constructing garments, doing the fine embroidery that marks the edges of a wealthy woman's sleeve as the product of particular skill. The tiny, precise stitches in silk thread that require an hour of concentration to produce what might seem, from a distance, to be a simple decorative band. She has been doing this work since she was 12, when she was apprenticed to an older seamstress in the Marais district, and the 26 years of practice have given her hands a knowledge that operates below the level of conscious attention. She can produce the stitches in low light, in conversation, with a child in the room. Her hands know what they are doing. She has 3 surviving children, daughters of 16 and 13, a son of 8, 3 of the 5 she has carried, the other 2 lost in the ordinary way of medieval childhood, to fevers and to the kind of respiratory infection that would today be treated with a week of antibiotics, and that then was simply the thing that took children, routinely, without drama, in numbers that the age absorbed with a grief that is hard to measure from the outside precisely, because it was so ordinary. She does not stop working when the plague comes to Paris. This is not callousness. She is frightened with the specific fear of a woman who has already watched 2 children die and cannot afford to watch 3 more, a fear that lives in the body rather than the mind, a permanent slight tension in the stomach that is there when she wakes up and there when she lies down and there through the middle of the day when she is working, and has, in some sense, forgotten to think about it. And then she looks up and sees the empty street below the window and remembers. But she cannot stop working, because the work is how the family eats. Henry's carpentry has been reduced. The construction projects that normally employ him have mostly stopped, because wealthy families have closed their houses and left the city, and the middle-class families who might commission furniture are too frightened to have strangers in the house, and the demand for coffins, while genuinely significant, is not the kind of work that a skilled carpenter finds dignifying, and is in any case being absorbed by men who specialize in it and who are currently among the busiest workers in the city. Henry is working less. The income from Marguerite's needle is more important than it has ever been. So she sews. She sews in the mornings when the light through the window is best, her chair pulled close to the GL. As not real glass stretched membrane, which lets in light and almost no view, with the fine thread on the frame beside her, and the work in her hands and her mind in the particular state that long practice at detailed work produces. A state of divided attention where the hands are fully occupied and the mind is partly free, partly monitoring the hands, partly elsewhere, partly in the street below, which she can hear even when she cannot see. The street below has changed. It is quieter now in the specific way that Paris has gone quiet while still being Paris, still having its essential noise. The market at the end of the street still functions, the church bells still ring, the water sellers still go by with their yoke and their buckets, but with a reduction in the casual, purposeless noise of a city fully at ease with itself. People walk faster. They greet each other from a greater distance. The children who used to fill the street in the afternoons are fewer and more subdued. Marguerite's eldest daughter is named Catherine. Catherine is 16 and has her mother's hands and her father's eyes and an intelligence that is wasted, in Marguerite's private opinion, on the options available to a girl of her social position in 14th century Paris, which are essentially marriage, a convent, or the continuation of the household trades. Catherine has been helping Marguerite with the sewing since she was 10 and is now capable of the less demanding embroidery work, the borders and the hemstitching, and she works alongside her mother in the mornings in a companionable silence that is one of the things Marguerite values most about the work. The silence that contains a relationship, the shared attention to the same task that produces, over years, a kind of intimacy that doesn't require speech. In October, Catherine develops a cough. Not the bubo, not the fever. A cough, dry, persistent, the kind of cough that in an ordinary autumn would be noted and watched and treated with honey and thyme, and might resolve in a week or might not. The kind of cough that is a cough, and nothing more except that, in the autumn of 1348 in Paris, no symptom is just what it is. Every symptom is also the question of whether this is how it starts. Marguerite watches Catherine the way she watches everything, flatly, carefully, without the outward expression of what she is feeling, which is something between terror and a very firm refusal to allow the terror to direct her behavior. She makes the honey and thyme. She checks Catherine's neck and armpits with a matter-of-factness that is itself a performance for Catherine's benefit, so that Catherine, who is 16 and capable of reading faces, will not read Marguerite's face and know what Marguerite is checking for. The cough resolves in 10 days. Not the plague, just a cough. Just a cough in October, as there have always been coughs in October, as there will always be coughs in October, the cold and the damp doing what they do to human respiratory systems, and the human respiratory systems responding in the way they respond. Marguerite puts the honey away. She picks up the embroidery. Her hands find the thread. She does not allow herself to feel the relief too fully, because the relief contains within it the acknowledgement of how frightened she was, and the acknowledgement of how frightened she was opens a door to the extent of what she is managing. And the extent of what she is managing is too large to open the door to in the middle of a working day with 3 children in the house and a husband whose income has halved, and an embroidery commission due before the end of the week. She acknowledges the relief in the specific way she acknowledges most things she cannot afford to fully feel. Briefly, sideways, with a compression that will open sometime later when there is space for it. She picks up the embroidery. Henry catches a fever in December. A real fever this time. A serious fever that puts him to bed on a Monday and keeps him there through the week, burning and sweating in a way that Marguerite watches with the full attention of someone who is monitoring 2 things simultaneously: the fever itself and the space under his arms and at his neck and groin, checking each morning for the swelling that would change the story from difficult to impossible. No swelling. The fever burns for 5 days. On the sixth day it breaks. She is sitting beside the bed when this happens, in the gray morning light of a December day, and she sees the moment it happens in his face. The loosening of the tension that fever holds the body in, the return of something recognizable in his expression, the opening of his eyes with the quality of someone returning from a long journey to find the room around them real and present and here. He looks at her. She puts her face down into the blanket next to his shoulder and stays there for a moment without moving. His hand comes up and rests on the back of her head. Then she straightens up. She goes and gets the basin of water and the cloth. She begins the practical work of bringing him back, the cooling water on his face, the broth that she has kept warm on the fire, the careful management of his return to the body he had almost lost. Later that day, she picks up the embroidery. The commission is still due before the end of the week. She works by lamplight, long past the hour when the rest of the household has gone to sleep, in the particular silence of a winter night in medieval Paris, which is the silence of a city that has partially emptied itself through death and migration, and the closing of doors that will not open again until spring. The lamp oil smells of tallow. The embroidery is a band of silver thread on dark blue wool, a repeating pattern of vine leaves that the noblewoman who commissioned it wants for the cuffs of a winter gown, and Marguerite's hands move through it with the absolute confidence of 26 years, the needle finding its way through the cloth in the lamplight as surely as it finds its way in full sun. She finishes the commission by Thursday. She delivers it on Friday. She is paid. She buys bread at the market on the way home, the same bread she has bought at this market for 15 years, from the same family of bakers, and she carries it home through streets that are quieter than they used to be, past houses that are empty, past the shrine to Saint Genevieve at the corner of the Rue du Four, where someone has left a small bunch of dried rosemary bound with a red thread. A folk offering that the church officially disapproves of, and that appears at these small urban shrines with the persistent regularity of a practice too old to be entirely suppressed. She gets home. She puts the bread on the table. Henry is sitting up in bed in the back room, reading, or rather, sitting with a book open on his lap that Marguerite suspects he is not reading so much as using as a prop for the particular kind of sitting that is his way of recovering, the sitting that looks like doing something in order to avoid having to fully acknowledge how depleted you are. The children are there, the fire is there. She sits down. After a moment, Catherine comes and sits beside her and leans against her shoulder in the way she has been doing since she was small, which is something that Marguerite has always accepted without comment, because Catherine will not always be small, and the shoulder will not always be there. And the warmth of it, the weight of this specific person against this specific shoulder, is something that the years are making more rather than less valuable. She holds the warmth. Outside, Paris is doing what Paris does, which is continuing regardless, which is perhaps the most Parisian thing about it. Now let me take you to a place that the history of the Black Death usually reaches more slowly than the cities, to the countryside, to the agricultural communities that grow the food that feeds the cities, to the world of fields and animals and the seasonal rhythms that are interrupted by the plague, not only in the human population, but in everything that the human population maintains. The fields don't care about the plague. The winter wheat that was planted before the deaths doesn't know that the farmer who planted it is dead. It grows anyway, in its patient, underground way, the slow chemistry of germination proceeding regardless of what is happening above the soil. And in the spring, when the surviving population looks at the fields, it finds them full of growing wheat that nobody planted with the intention of abandoning it. But there is nobody to harvest it. This is one of the plague's cascading consequences, the labor shortage that follows mass death, The medieval agricultural system runs on human labor with a specificity and a precision that requires most of the community to be present and functional at the specific moments when the work needs doing. The planting window is narrow. The harvest window is narrow. The preparation of the soil is labor-intensive. The thrashing is labor-intensive. Every stage requires bodies, and the bodies are not there. In a village in the Ile-de-France, an hour's walk from Paris, there is a man named Pierre who is the reeve, the official responsible for managing the agricultural operations of the manor, the person who coordinates the labor of the village on behalf of the lord whose land this technically is, though the lord is in Paris and has been in Paris for most of the past decade. Pierre is 52 years old. He has been reeve for 12 years. He has the particular combination of administrative competence and practical knowledge that the job requires, the ability to keep the Lord's records in the correct form while also knowing exactly how many days of labor each field requires at each stage of the year, a knowledge that he carries in his head and in the accumulated judgments of 12 years of watching the same operations repeat. Of the 63 adults in the village when the plague arrived, 41 are alive in the spring of 1349. Pierre looks at the fields. He looks at the 41 people. He does the calculation that the reeve's job requires him to do, how much labor is available versus how much labor is needed, and the calculation is stark. There is not enough labor to manage the full acreage. There is not enough labor to do everything the way it has always been done. He calls a meeting. In the remains of the village, in the open space near the church, the 41 surviving adults gather to hear what Pierre has to say, and what he says is simple. We cannot farm all the land. We must decide which fields to let go fallow and which to work. We must reallocate the labor across the remaining holdings. Some of what we have always done will not be done this year. We must decide what matters most. This is a practical conversation about agricultural management, but it is also something else. It is the survivors of a catastrophe taking stock of what remains and deciding collectively how to proceed, which is the fundamental social act of recovery. And it has to happen in fields and meeting squares and fishing harbors and monastery hospitals and bakehouse, doorways all across Europe in the spring of 1349, in thousands of versions of the same conversation, each one small and local and specific and part of the larger story of how the world goes on. They decide together. Certain fields are prioritized, the best soil, the most reliable yields. Certain tasks are consolidated. The work is redistributed across the remaining households in ways that cut across the old divisions of the manor system, because the old system was calibrated for 63 adults and there are 41 now, and the calibration must change. Pierre records all of this in the manor's ledger in Latin, in the careful administrative hand that 12 years of record-keeping have developed. He records the decisions made, the fields designated for work, the fields to lie fallow. He records the names of the dead, because the Lord will eventually return and will want to know why the income from the manor has changed, and the answer that 22 of his villagers are dead is in the ledger. He writes the names carefully. Each one. He has known all of them his entire life. They are not administrative categories to him. They are people who are now in a column of the ledger under the heading of departed, which is the word the administrative language uses, as if they have gone somewhere else rather than simply ceased. He writes the names. He closes the ledger. He goes out to organize the spring planting. There is one more person I want to bring you to before we follow the full arc of these lives through the years of the plague and out the other side, into the changed world that emerges from it. And this person is a child, which is to say this person is the part of the story that is hardest to hold, because children have been dying in every generation of human history from diseases that adults have had partial immunity to. And the plague does not distinguish by age any more than it distinguishes by virtue. And the child-shaped holes in the record of 1348 and 1349 are everywhere once you learn to look for them. The child's name is Thomas. He is 9 years old. He lives in the city of Bruges, in what is today Belgium, which in 1348 is one of the great cloth trading cities of Northern Europe, wealthy and densely populated and thoroughly connected to the trade routes along which the plague travels. His father is a weaver, his mother the daughter of a dyer, and the world of colored cloth is the world Thomas was born into. The smell of dye and the sound of the loom as fundamental to his existence as any natural feature of the landscape. He is a small, precise, watchful child, the kind who sits quietly in the corner of a room and takes things in without announcing that he is doing so, who notices things that adults haven't noticed because adults have stopped paying the full, fresh attention that children pay to everything before they learn to filter it. He is 9, and he is at the age when boys of his social class in this period are being prepared for the beginning of an apprenticeship, the transition from childhood to the beginning of the long education of a trade. This transition will be delayed by the plague. His father gets sick in October 1348, not the bubo, something in the chest, a pneumonic variant, a different form of the same disease that moves through the lungs with a different speed and a different presentation. He is dead in 6 days. Thomas's mother, Marta, does not get sick. Thomas does not get sick. His younger sister, who is 5, does not get sick. Thomas is 9 years old and his father is dead, and he does not fully understand what this means in the immediate term, because Ini is old enough to understand death, and not old enough to fully understand the cascade of practical consequences that death sets in motion for a family that depended on the dead person's labor. What he understands is that his father is not there. The workshop is quiet in a way it has never been quiet before. The loom stands silent. His mother is doing things that she does with the compressed efficiency of a person who is frightened and cannot afford to be frightened. And Thomas watches her and understands that watching is what he can do right now. That being present and not adding to the burden and helping when there is specific help to offer are the contributions available to him at 9 years old. He helps. He carries things. He fetches water. He takes messages to the neighbors who are part of the network of mutual support that the guild system maintains for members in difficulty. The other weavers' families who know Marta and knew his father, and who respond with the practical solidarity of people who understand that what has happened to his family could happen to theirs. One morning in November, he helps Marta carry a bundle of cloth to the house of a merchant who owes his father for work already done. And the merchant, a large man named Mitchell who has a cold, careful quality that Thomas does not like, debates the price. He debates it on the grounds that the work is not entirely to specification, which Marta disputes quietly and which Thomas, standing beside her, knows is not true because he watched his father weave that cloth and it was good. It was the best his father did, and the merchant knows it and is using the circumstance of the father's death and the mother's desperation to reduce the price. Marta takes the reduced price. They walk home. Thomas carries the bundle that contained the cloth, now empty, folded under his arm. He does not say anything about what happened in the merchant's house. Marta does not say anything. They walk through the October streets of Bruges, which is a beautiful city even now, even in this. The tightly packed Flemish houses with their steep gables and their carved doorways. The canals running through the city's center carrying flat-bottomed boats. The market hall still standing at the center of the city with the year's business still proceeding within it, changed but proceeding. Thomas thinks about the merchant. He thinks about the cloth his father made and the price that Mitchell paid and the gap between them, which is small in absolute terms and enormous in terms of what it means. He doesn't yet have words for what he is thinking. He is 9. But the thing he is thinking will have words when he is older, and the words will be something like, "The world is a place where this happens, and you cannot simply accept that it does, and the question of what to do about it will constitute a significant portion of the rest of my life." He is 9. He carries the empty bundle home. He helps his mother make the evening meal. The canals of Bruges are dark in the October evening and very still, and the reflection of the city in them is wavering and exact. And Thomas walks past them without looking because he is 9, and the canals are always there, and he does not yet know that he will miss them when he is older. He goes in. The door closes. The canals continue their stillness. Now, let us step back from the individual lives for a moment and look at what the plague is doing to the larger world, the world of ideas and institutions, and the slow movements of society that are not visible in any single person's story, but that these stories, taken together, begin to reveal. The church is under a strain it has not experienced before. The church in 1348 is not simply a religious institution. It is the organizing framework of European intellectual and social life. It runs the universities, maintains the hospitals, provides the legal structure for marriage and inheritance and death, defines the moral vocabulary within which people understand their lives, and performs the ritual functions, baptism, marriage, last rites, that mark the transitions of human existence and give them meaning within the community. All of this depends on priests, and the priests are dying at the same rate as everyone else, or faster, because the duties of a priest in a plague year, visiting the sick, performing last rites, remaining present in the community when the natural response to terror is withdrawal, bring them into contact with the disease more often than they might otherwise encounter it. The priests who do their jobs are the priests who are most exposed, and the priests who are most exposed are the priests who are most likely to die. And the dying of the priests creates a demand for new priests that the church's ordinary processes of formation and ordination cannot satisfy. The result is emergency ordinations. Men who would, in normal circumstances, have spent years in preparation for the priesthood, in study, in moral formation, in the careful process of discernment and training that the church maintains precisely because the priest's role is central enough to require this care, are instead ordained in months or weeks, in some documented cases in days, because the sacraments must be administered, and the only people who can administer them are dying, and their replacements must be found quickly. The rapid ordinations produce priests who are less educated than their predecessors, less rigorously formed, less certain of the theology that underlies their function. This has consequences. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the way that all institutional shortcuts have consequences, accumulated over years, producing in the decades after the plague a clerical class that is in some measurable ways less capable than the one it replaced, and which becomes, as the century continues, one of the targets of a reformist critique that grows through the latter half of the 14th century and the 15th and into the 16th, when it becomes something larger. The crisis of the 14th century church, traced back far enough, touches the plague. This is how history works, not in the dramatic chain of one thing directly causing another, but in the slow, complex cascade of a disruption that moves through systems, appearing in new forms decades later, in places that don't look connected to the original event. The priest ordained too quickly in 1349 is one link in a chain that leads, with many intermediary steps, to Martin Luther nailing his theses to a church door in 1517. This is not a simple causation, but it is a real connection, and it is the kind of connection that shows itself only when you look at the plague not as an event, but as a process, one that is still happening long after the last bubo has healed. The flagellants are also happening. Groups of men, hundreds of them in some cases, processing through the towns of Germany and the Low Countries in France, whipping themselves with leather straps studded with iron nails, singing hymns, performing their public penance in town squares and outside churches, gathering crowds of watchers who are simultaneously horrified and drawn in by the spectacle, which connects to something in the medieval religious imagination that finds meaning in visible physical suffering, the imitation of Christ's passion in flesh. The body as the site of atonement. The flagellants are frightening to the church authorities, not because of their self-inflicted wounds, but because of their implicit claim to a direct relationship with God that bypasses the institutional mediation of the church. They are performing absolution for themselves and offering it to those who join them, which is theologically irregular and institutionally threatening, and which, combined with their other behaviors, the violence against Jewish communities, the challenging of local clergy, the charismatic authority of their leaders, produces a response from the Pope that is ultimately suppressive. Pope Clement VI condemns the flagellant movement in October 1349. He does so from Avignon, where he has also already issued the bull Quamvis Perfidium, condemning the violence against Jewish communities that the plague is producing throughout Europe. In it, he makes the logical observation that the plague is killing Jewish people as often as Christians, which should be sufficient evidence that Jewish people did not cause it. The bull has some effect. In some regions, the pogroms stop or are suppressed. In others, they continue. The violence is real, and it is one of the things that the plague does to European society that has the longest legacy, deepening the patterns of suspicion and exclusion and periodic eruption into organized violence that will mark European Jewish life for centuries afterward. This is part of the plague story too, the part that isn't about survival and resilience and the stubborn persistence of ordinary life, but about what fear and grief do to communities when there is no adequate explanation for what is happening to them, and the need to assign responsibility is overwhelming. Brother Anselm writes about this. He writes about it in the monastery's chronicle with the careful, steady handwriting that he maintains through everything, and he writes it in Latin because Latin is the language of the record, but what he writes is in the register of the personal rather than the official, a departure from the chronicle's usual tone of institutional documentation. The sickness does not distinguish. We should not distinguish in its name. He writes this in the spring of 1349, from a monastery that has lost more than half its community, from a vantage point of accumulated grief and continued function, from the position of a man who has been writing the word person beside every name on his list for 6 months, and who means it with increasing urgency. The sickness does not distinguish. It does not distinguish between the devout and the faithless, between the virtuous and the cruel, between the noble and the common, between the Christian and the Jew. It moves through the body's biology without reference to the soul's condition, which is the fact that strains the theological framework of the age more severely than any single doctrinal challenge. Because if suffering is punishment for sin, then the death of children and the survival of murderers requires explanation, and the explanations available in 1348 are insufficient. Some people respond to this insufficiency by intensifying their faith, the logic being that the inadequacy of any earthly explanation is itself an argument for divine mystery, for a God whose ways are not our ways and cannot be comprehended from within our limited vantage point. This is the response of Brother Anselm, essentially, and it is coherent, and it sustains him through the year. Some people respond by beginning, quietly, to loosen their grip on the framework. Not abandoning it, that is too dramatic and too dangerous in 1348, when the church is the structure within which everything meaningful happens and deviation from it is an extremely serious matter. But beginning to hold it differently, with slightly more space between the hand and the thing held, a slight increase in the distance between the received explanation and the observed fact. The beginnings of something that is not doubt exactly. Doubt is too active a word, but something more like the accommodation of uncertainty within belief, the maintenance of faith alongside the acknowledgement that the faith does not explain everything. This too has a long legacy. The 14th century ends. The 15th century happens. The 16th century begins with its disruptions and its arguments about exactly what the church is and what it should be and what authority it should claim. The trail of these arguments followed back to its origins passes through the plague years not as a simple causation, but as a presence, a loosening, a place where the grip changed. History is rarely as tidy as causes and effects. It is more often like this. Something enormous happens, and it changes something, and the change changes something else. And decades later, you are looking at a world that is different in ways that are connected to the original enormous thing, but not obviously, not simply, not in a way that yields a clean single line of causation. The plague happens, the world changes. The changes take centuries to fully reveal themselves. And in the middle of all of it, people are buying bread and laying out bodies, and delivering babies and sailing boats, and keeping accounts and placing fresh flowers at shrines and sitting beside the sick with a cup of water. The enormous and the small, happening simultaneously in the same world at the same moment. By the summer of 1349, the worst of the first wave is over in most of Western Europe. This does not mean it is finished. The disease will return in 1361, in 1369, in 1374, and again through the following century, diminishing waves each time as the surviving population develops partial immunity and the available pool of people without any prior exposure shrinks. The word plague will retain its specific terror for 2 more centuries, until it becomes historical rather than personal, something your grandparents lived through rather than something happening now. But the first wave is over, and the continent that comes up from under it is changed in ways that are still being counted. A third to a half of the population is gone, in some regions more than that. The demographic contraction is so large that its effects move through every system the society contains: the labor supply, the price of food, the organization of landholding, the relationship between landlords and the people who work their land, the functioning of the church, the structure of the universities, the conduct of trade, the patterns of inheritance and property that determine who has what and on what terms. The labor shortage is the most immediately consequential change. Dead peasants leave fields unfilled, and unfilled fields mean unfed cities, and unfed cities are politically dangerous in ways that medieval rulers understand very well. But dead peasants also leave a shortage of labor that the surviving peasants begin, slowly, to leverage. Where there were many workers and few positions, there are now few workers and many positions, and the fundamental bargain of feudal labor. You work this land for these terms, and the terms are set by the Lord, and the Lord sets them because there is nowhere else for you to go, begins to shift. There is somewhere else to go. The surviving laborer can move to another manor that needs workers and is willing to offer better terms, can refuse work at the old rate and hold out for a higher wage, can, in some documented cases, walk away from a holding that was barely viable before the plague, and find land that is better and take it because the person who was farming it is gone. The lords resist this. There are laws, the statute of laborers in England, similar ordinances in France and elsewhere, that attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, to prevent the labor market from functioning in the way that a reduced supply of labor would naturally drive it. These laws are enforced with varying degrees of rigor. They are also, in many places, simply ignored, because the economic reality is stronger than the legal requirement, and an empty field is a more powerful argument than a statute. The slow erosion of feudal labor relations that historians trace through the latter half of the 14th century and into the 15th has many causes. The plague is one of them, not the only one, but one of the largest. Pierre, the reeve in the Ile-de-France village, notices this. He notices it in the requests that come to him in the spring and summer of 1349. The requests for renegotiated terms, for reduced labor obligations, for the kind of flexibility in the manor's arrangements that would have been impossible before because the power balance did not allow it. He notices it in the absence of 2 men who left the village during the winter and did not return, who are working somewhere else under better terms, which he knows because he has heard from a cousin who works on a manor half a day's walk away. He records the negotiations in the ledger. He presents them to the Lord, who sends back a response through a steward that amounts to, "Manage it as best you can. The Lord is in Paris and is not coming back to this village anytime soon, and his primary concern is that the income from the estate continues to arrive." Pierre manages it. He negotiates the terms that the surviving labor force is demanding, which are somewhat better than the old terms in several respects, and considerably better in one. The requirement of certain categories of obligatory unpaid labor, the plowing of the Lord's fields, the carting of his grain, is reduced, partly because there is not enough labor to do all of it, and partly because the people he is negotiating with are no longer in a position where they have no alternative. He records all of it in the ledger. He records it with the same care he records everything, because the record is his protection. If the Lord returns and questions the terms, the ledger shows the decisions made and the circumstances that produced them, and Pierre has been careful to document the circumstances. The deaths, the labor shortage, the negotiations, the reasoning, all of it there in the careful administrative Latin, in the handwriting that 12 years have made consistent and legible. He is not thinking about the long arc of history. He is not thinking about the slow dissolution of feudalism or the centuries-long shift in the relationship between labor and capital that the plague has nudged into motion. He is thinking about the spring planting and the labor he has available, and the terms he has agreed to, and whether the rye in the eastern field will need to come in before the wheat in the northern one. He is thinking about the immediate task, which is the only task anyone can actually think about, and which is nonetheless part of the larger story, which is always the case. Now let me bring our people back together, one by one, and show you where they are when the worst of the first wave is over. Teodora is alive in Messina in the summer of 1349. The harbor has reopened, cautiously. Some of the merchants who left have returned. The market has more vendors than it had in the worst months, fewer than it had before any of it started. The butcher's stall across from her house is still closed, but a young man, the butcher's nephew, she thinks, though she is not certain, has been seen cleaning it. And this is the kind of detail that Teodora notices and files as evidence in the case she is building, every day, for the proposition that things will eventually be normal again. Not the same. She has abandoned the expectation of the same, but normal in the sense of a regularity that can be relied upon, a predictability in the days that allows you to plan and to work, and to move through the world without the constant background calculation of risk that has become second nature over the past 2 years. She goes to the market. She goes every morning now, as she did before, though the rounds are shorter because there are fewer vendors and the prices are strange. Some things cheaper because there is too much of them and not enough people to buy. Some things far more expensive because the supply chains are disrupted, and the farmers who grew them or the merchants who transported them are not all there anymore. She has had to renegotiate her sense of what things cost, what she can afford, what constitutes a reasonable price for a quantity of salted fish. The renegotiation is ongoing. She thinks about her daughter, who is alive in the southern part of the city, who she sees on Sundays. She thinks about her son, who is not alive. She has been thinking about her son every day for 2 years with the particular quality of thought that grief produces in its second year, when the acute, overwhelming immediacy of the first year has passed, and what remains is a permanent presence, a weight that is always there, that you carry rather than experience in the sharp way you experienced it at the beginning. She buys fish, she goes home, she salts it. The shed behind the house smells of salt and wood and the cold Atlantic air that comes in through the gap near the roof, and she works in it through the morning with the automatic competence of a woman who has been doing this for 20 years, and her mind is partly on the work and partly on her son, and partly on the specific angle of the November light through the gap in the roof. which is the same angle it has been every November. Which means that November is here again, and the year is turning as it always turns, and the world is continuing in the specific way that the world continues regardless. She finishes, she goes inside, she makes the midday meal. Benedetto is there, older looking than he was 2 years ago in the specific way that crisis accelerates certain kinds of aging, the lines on his face deeper, his hair more gray. They eat together at the table they have eaten at for 30 years. Outside, the street sounds are somewhat thinner than they used to be, but they are there. They are both alive. They eat their meal together in the November light, and it is, in the specific way that everything is now enough. Agnes is alive in her English village in the spring of 1350. 7 people died in the village over the plague winter out of approximately 90, fewer than many places, more than none. Agnes holds both of these facts simultaneously because both are true and the truth requires both. Thomas is alive. Maud is alive, 10 years old now and increasingly sharp in a way that both pleases Agnes and demands more from her, because a sharp child requires a responsive parent and Agnes has not always had the energy for it in these months. William is alive, 7, already helping in the bakehouse in small ways, carrying things, sweeping, absorbing the trade through proximity the way children absorb everything. The bakehouse is running. This is the fact around which Agnes organizes the evidence that things are returning to some form of viable. The bakehouse runs on its schedule, the oven fed before dawn, the bread out by morning, the stall at the market twice a week. Thomas is at the stall. Agnes is in the bakehouse and the accounts and the flour negotiations with the miller, who is the same difficult man he has always been, which is itself a form of normalcy. She thinks about Ellen occasionally. Not every day. The grief has settled into something quieter than daily, something that surfaces in specific contexts. When she passes the house, when she sees the smith working alone in his yard without his wife coming to bring him something in the middle of the afternoon, when she is laying out a piece of cloth for a new dress for Maud and her hands find the exact kind of fold that Ellen was good at, the specific tuck at the seam that Agnes never learned as well. She carries this the way she carries everything she cannot put down. The spring is coming. You can feel it in the ground beginning to soften, the particular change in the light that tells you the angle of the sun is shifting, the rooks in the elm trees louder than they've been since autumn. Agnes stands in the yard behind the house with the chickens around her feet in the early morning and breathes the cold and listens to the rooks. It will be spring. The spring has always come, regardless of everything, and this spring will come too. She goes inside and begins the bread. Giovanni is alive in Florence in 1350, and he is 28 years old. He has been standing at the east window every morning since Marco died, watching the light come up over the rooftops for a few minutes before he goes to work. He cannot explain this habit satisfactorily even to himself. He has tried in the journal and produced several attempts that he has crossed out as insufficient. He only knows that he began doing it and has not stopped, and that the light coming up over the rooftops is one of the things that has remained constant through the years that have changed so much else. He works. The cloth trade has resumed, partially. Florence lost something between a third and a half of its population, and the fabric of the commercial world that depended on that population has been restructured, consolidated, in some cases simply ended. There are merchants who did not survive who will not be replaced, workshops that closed and did not reopen, relationships of credit and trade that ended, and whose ending simplified the network in ways that will take years to fully understand. His parents are alive. His father is older in the specific way that grief and proximity to mass death age a person. His mother prays more than she did before, a practice that she has intensified and made more central to her day in a way that her family accommodates without comment. Giovanni goes to Santa Croce on Sundays. He lights a candle for Marco. This takes approximately 2 minutes and is the most important 2 minutes of his week, which is a thing he would not have predicted about himself 2 years ago, and which he now simply accepts as true. On a Sunday in March 1350, he is walking home from Santa Cruz when he passes the shrine on the Via dei Servi where the fresh flowers are always placed. He stops. There are roses there today, late winter roses, pale and slightly fragile, stems in the small clay pot, the water in the pot fresh from this morning. He has been passing this shrine for 2 years, and someone has been placing fresh flowers at it throughout. Through the worst months, through the winter, through the spring and summer and autumn and back to winter. Every week, fresh flowers. He has thought about who does this without ever trying to find out, treating the anonymity as part of what makes it meaningful. The fact that the gesture is made without any witness or acknowledgement, purely for its own sake, purely for the Virgin painted on the corner wall who may or may not be aware of it, but for whom it is done regardless. He stands in front of the shrine for a long moment. Then he takes a coin from his pocket, a small coin, not significant in monetary terms, and he places it at the base of the shrine, beside the clay pot carefully, as if placing it in the exact right position matters. He doesn't know why he does this. He doesn't analyze it. He simply does it and walks on. He goes to the window when he gets home. The afternoon light is doing something with the tiles of the rooftops, turning them from terracotta to amber, and the smoke from the chimneys is going straight up in the still air, and Florence is making its afternoon sounds, reduced from what they were before, still recognizably Florence, still the city he was born in. He opens the journal. He has written less in it recently. The need that drove the writing, the need to put the weight of fear somewhere external, to create a container for what was happening, has diminished as the immediate crisis has passed. What remains is something else, less urgent, more reflective, the record of a person who has been through something and is in the process of understanding what it has made of him. He writes, "I placed a coin at the shrine today. I don't know why." He thinks for a moment. He writes, "I think it was for Marco, and for the person who brings the flowers, and for the city, and for all of us who are still here, which feels this afternoon like something worth marking." He puts the pen down. He goes to the window and watches the light. Brother Anselm is alive in the monastery at Avignon in 1351. The community has grown back to 29 brothers, new ordinations filling some of the gaps left by the dead. The canonical hours continue, matins and lauds and prime and terce and sext and nun and vespers and compline, the wheel of prayer turning as it has always turned, now with 29 voices rather than 43, a slightly thinner sound in the choir but the same sound, recognizably the same, the words unchanged. He still works in the hospital in the afternoons. The hospital is not full of plague patients anymore, mostly. There are occasional cases, the disease not entirely gone from the region, but the overwhelming crisis of 1348 and 1349 has passed, and the hospital has returned to something closer to its ordinary function. The care of the sick from the surrounding community, the fevers and injuries and the slow illnesses of age that have always been there and will always be there. He brings water, he changes dressings, he sits beside people. He still keeps the list. The list is very long now. It fills both sides of several sheets of parchment. Every person who has passed through the hospital since the plague year, named, with their outcome noted and the word person beside each name. He adds to it as people come and go, the list becoming over the years a kind of private monument, a record of presence that the official chronicle does not keep, the names that history does not consider worth preserving. He considers them worth preserving. He is 57 years old. His hands ache in the cold now, a new development of the past year, the joints of his fingers stiff in the morning until the work of the day warms them. He notes this the way he notes all physical facts, with the attention of a man who has learned to pay close attention to the body's evidence, which is part of the monastic tradition of Car. And part of simply having been alive long enough to understand that the body is a text worth reading. He prays for the dead, for Clement, who illuminated manuscripts with tiny animals, for the others. He prays for the living. He prays for Isabel, wherever she is, though he will never know whether she survived the winter. He prays for the person who places flowers at whatever shrine they place flowers at, though he doesn't know this person exists, has no way of knowing, because he is in Avignon and they are in Florence, and the world is not yet connected in the way that would make such knowledge possible. But the prayer is the same prayer, in some sense, the prayer for the people who keep doing the thing that seems worth doing, who maintain the small gestures of care and attention in the middle of the large things that make small gestures seem insufficient and make them, in fact, the most important thing. He writes in the Chronicle, "We are diminished. We continue." He has written this before. He writes it again because it is still true, and things that are true deserve to be written as many times as they are true. He goes to Compline. The 29 voices fill the choir, thinner than before and still the same. Havard is alive in Norway in 1351. He is 43. The boat has been repaired. He goes out in it 3 or 4 times a week when the weather allows, with 2 men from the village, different men than before, because the men from before are gone, but men nonetheless, reliable, learning the rhythms of the work in the way that work teaches its rhythms if you stay with it long enough. The fjord is the same fjord it has always been. He goes out in the morning in the cold and the dark, and he puts out the nets, and he waits in the specific patient way of someone who has been doing this long enough to know that waiting is the job, that the waiting is not separate from the fishing, but is the fishing, and the fish come or they don't, and either way you go back in the afternoon and you come home. Sigrid is there. The 3 children are there. The youngest, the boy, is 8 now and has started coming down to the harbor to watch his father work, and Havard lets him come without making it a formal apprenticeship, letting the harbor and the boat speak for themselves, letting the boy absorb what the harbor has to teach through the senses rather than through instruction. One afternoon the boy asks, "Will the sickness come back?" Havard is mending a net. His hands continue mending while he thinks about this, the familiar motion of the needle through the mesh going on without his attention, which frees his attention for the question. He says, "I don't know." The boy considers this. He says, "But we would be okay." Havard looks at his son. He looks at the fjord, which is very still this afternoon, the gray water flat and the mountains reflected in it with a precision that seems almost excessive, the reflection more detailed than necessary. He looks at the boat, repaired at the bow, the wood sound, the caulking good. He says, "Yes, we would be okay." The boy nods, satisfied with this, the way children are satisfied with honest answers from people they trust, which is one of the things that makes children better at certain kinds of knowing than adults. They mend the net together. Thomas, the weaver's son in Bruges, is 11 in 1350. His mother Marta has established herself in the 2 years since his father died as a capable, independent operator of the workshop, which she was not supposed to be, and which she has become anyway through the straightforward mechanism of there being no one else available and the work needing to be done. She has the guild's grudging tolerance rather than its approval, which is the form that tolerance usually takes when the rules are designed for a world that no longer quite exists. Thomas works beside her. He is 11 and he is good with his hands, and he watches everything with the same quiet attention he has always given the world, and the watching is becoming something. Not quite skill, not yet, but the precondition of skill, the attention that skill requires before it can develop. He thinks about the merchant Mitchell sometimes. He thinks about the cloth his father made and the price Mitchell paid and the gap between them. And the more time passes, the more clearly he understands what that gap was, what it represented, what it revealed about the structure of the world he is growing up in. He will do something with this understanding eventually. He doesn't know yet what. He is 11. For now he weaves. The shuttle goes back and forth through the warp threads in the rhythm his father's hands taught him before they were gone, and the cloth builds thread by thread in the frame, and the sound of the loom is the sound of the house, and the sound of the house is the sound of his childhood, and the cloth grows under his hands and is good. Pierre the Rive is Al. Ive in his village in the Isle de France. The spring planting is done. The fields are growing, the chosen fields, the ones they decided to work, not all the land that was worked before. The fallow fields are already beginning to show signs of what fallow fields show. The slow return of grass and scrub to land that the plow is not visiting this year. The beginning of a process that will continue if the labor shortage continues, which Pierre expects it will. He is making a new calculation. The old calculation of the manor system. This much land requires this many people, organized in this way, to produce this amount for the Lord no longer works with the numbers he has. He is inventing a new calculation, essentially from first principles, based on the labor available and the yields achievable, and the minimum required to feed the village and pay the Lord's dues and maintain enough surplus to get through a bad year. He writes the new calculation in the ledger. He is aware, without having a historical framework for it, that he is doing something that will look different in retrospect than it looks now, that the arrangements he is negotiating with the surviving villagers in this spring of 1350 are part of a shift in how this kind of community organizes itself, a shift that the plague has forced, but that has its own momentum now, its own logic that is starting to override the older logic. He doesn't think about it in these terms. He thinks about the fields and the planting calendar and the labor he has and the work that needs to be done. He closes the ledger. He goes out to check on the rye. Now I want to come back to something I said near the beginning, when I told you that this was not going to be a story about numbers. I want to try to explain what I meant. The numbers of the Black Death are staggering. Between 75 and 200 million people dead worldwide. A third to a half of Europe's population gone in 4 years. These are numbers that the mind genuinely cannot hold as numbers. They are too large, too abstract, too far from anything the human scale of experience is calibrated to process. And so the mind does what it does with large abstract things. It converts them into the familiar. It makes them into stories. It finds the specific, the named, the individual Teodora at the harbor, Agnes in the bakehouse, Giovanni at the window, Brother Anselm and his list, Havard and his boat, Thomas and his loom, Marguerite and her needle, Pierre and his ledger. And it holds those instead of the numbers because those are holdable, because a person is holdable in a way that 100 million is not. This is not a compromise or a failure of historical thinking. It is how historical thinking has to work if it is going to be useful to actual human beings trying to understand something about their own experience. Because the point is not the numbers. The point is what the numbers are made of, which is people, individual, specific, irreducible people, each one a world, each one carrying a complete and unrepeatable version of what it is like to be alive in this moment on this earth. Each one doing the work of their particular day in the middle of the enormous thing that is happening to their world. And then doing it again the next day. And then again. The medieval European world had a word for this quality. It used several words, actually, but the one that appears most often in the surviving literature of the plague years is perseverantia. Perseverance. Not heroic perseverance, not the perseverance of the warrior charging the enemy line. The perseverance of the person who picks up the bread in the morning and goes to the market and comes home and makes the evening meal and lies down and gets up and does it again. This perseverance is the mechanism of survival, not just the biological survival of the individual body, the immune system doing its biochemical work, but the survival of the community, the survival of the capacity to live together and care for each other and do the work that keeps everyone alive. It is the perseverance of Marta at the loom and Pierre at his ledger, and Marguerite at her needle, and Havard at his nets and Agnes at her flower. And each of these individuals maintaining their function is part of the maintenance of the larger function. The way each individual thread in a piece of cloth is part of what makes the cloth capable of holding its shape. And this, perhaps, is the thing I want you to take from this night in the plague years of the 14th century. Not the numbers, which are incomprehensible, not the dramatic or the terrible, which are real but not the whole of the story, but the texture of what it was like to keep going, the specific, sensory, daily texture of a life being lived through a catastrophe, with the bread and the thread and the nets and the ledger and the morning light coming through the window of a city that has been through something it will never forget in. D is stubbornly still there. You know something about this texture. The past few years of the century you live in have given you your own version of it. Not the same version, the scale is different. The mechanisms are different. The outcomes are different in ways that matter enormously. But the texture, the specific quality of continuing to do the ordinary things while the extraordinary thing is happening that you know. You have lived in that texture. You have been Agnes going to the market and Marguerite picking up the needle and Havard mending the net. You know what it is to keep going. You have been keeping going. And you are here now, at the end of a long night in a history that is yours as much as theirs, because it is the history of a species that you belong to, in a long chain of people who kept going and made the next generation possible, all the way down to the moment in which you exist, which is now in this room, with the night outside the window and the warmth of wherever you are keeping the cold at bay, exactly as it has always been. The plague is 2/3 of a millennium away. The fresh flowers at the shrine in Florence were placed by hands that have been dust for 6 centuries. Havard's fjord is still there. The rooks in Agnes's elm trees are still there, different rooks, but the same trees, or trees that grew from the seeds of those trees, or trees that grew from the seeds of those trees' seeds. The unbroken line of elm trees running forward through the centuries to the trees that are there now. Brother Anselm's list is gone, if it ever existed outside the imagination of this particular night, but the impulse behind it, the insistence on the individual, the refusal to let persons become statistics, the word written beside every name, that impulse is not gone. It is present in every person who has ever chosen to pay attention to the specific and the individual when the temptation was to deal only in the general. It is present now, in the attention you are giving to these people, in the fact that you spent this night with them. The list continues. Every name on it is followed by the word person. Every name on it includes yours. Sleep now. You have been in good company tonight. The company of people who knew what it was to be frightened and to continue anyway, to grieve and to continue, to lose people and to continue, to stand outside in the cold and look up at the stars and then go back inside and make the evening meal. That company has never been small. That company is, in the most literal biological sense, everyone who is alive today. Every person on earth is descended from someone who survived something, who kept going when the world gave them strong reasons not to, who planted the wheat or mended the net or placed the flowers or wrote the word. You are not separate from that. You are part of it. You are the current end of a chain that began before anyone was keeping records, and that extends forward from where you are into a future that will, in its own time, have its own catastrophes and its own Agnes and its own brother Anselm writing the word beside every name. But that is not tonight. Tonight is warm and quiet, and the past is keeping you company, and the morning will come when it comes. Let it come. Until then, rest. If you've been with us tonight here at Dull Tales, thank you. Genuinely. This is the kind of content that only exists because people choose to spend a night with it, and I'm grateful you were here. Hit like if the slow pace and the long journey are what you came for. Subscribe for more nights like this one. Leave a comment, tell me where you are, tell me if you made it to the end, tell me which of these people stayed with you. Every comment is a person. I read them all. Next time, we go further east and further back, onto the ancient road between Samarkand and the setting sun, among the merchants and the camels and the long, dusty, magnificent distances of the Silk Road. But that's next time. For now, good night. The stars are out.